The gun was already drawn when Ruth Thatcher walked through the door of the Silver Spur Saloon, and the man holding it was pointing it directly at her chest. She did not flinch. She had stopped flinching at guns 3 months ago, somewhere east of the Missouri River, when she had buried everything she had ever loved in a churchyard outside of Cincinnati, and decided that fear was a luxury she could no longer afford. She stood in the doorway with the desert sun blazing orange behind her, her brown traveling dress caked with the red dust of New Mexico territory, and she looked straight past the barrel of the revolver into the eyes of the man holding it. Those eyes were the color of weathered oak. They were not cruel eyes, but they were not soft ones either. They were the eyes of a man who had seen betrayal so many times that it had carved permanent lines around his mouth. A man whose dark past had settled into his face the way sediment settles into river rock, quietly, completely, without apology. "I said nobody comes through that door," the man said. His voice was low and controlled in the way that voices only get when their owners have trained themselves not to show what they are actually feeling. "You said that to the men outside," Ruth replied, and her own voice did not waver, which surprised her more than it surprised him. "I am not one of the men outside." A silence fell over the saloon that was so complete she could hear the flies circling the spilled whiskey on the nearest table. There were perhaps 12 people in the room, none of them breathing. Behind the bar, a heavy-set man with a waxed mustache had both hands flat on the counter and his eyes squeezed shut. Two women in silk dresses that had once been expensive stood pressed against the far wall. And at the center of it all, between Ruth and the door she had just walked through, stood Roscoe Malone, with his revolver trained on a woman who had come west to escape everything she used to be. Then, slowly, he lowered the gun. "Get against the wall," he said. "All of you get against the wall and nobody does anything stupid." He had not said it to Ruth. He had said it to the room. But his eyes had not left her face, and she felt something pass between them in that moment, something that had no name yet, something she had not felt since the life she was running from had been a life worth living. It was a dangerous feeling. It was the kind of feeling that, in her experience, preceded catastrophe. She had come to the town of Red Rock, New Mexico territory, in the autumn of 1883, not because she had planned to, but because the stage had broken a wheel 12 miles outside of town, and the driver had declared that Red Rock was the nearest place with a blacksmith. She had been heading to Santa Fe with every intention of disappearing into its maze of adobe streets and starting over as a seamstress or a schoolteacher or anything at all that was not who she used to be. But the wheel had broken, and the stage had limped into Red Rock just as the sun was setting, and the Silver Spur Saloon had been the first building with light in its windows. She had not known, when she pushed that door open, that she was walking into the middle of a hostage situation. She had not known, when she met the eyes of Roscoe Malone, that she was walking into something far more lasting than that. 3 months earlier, Ruth Thatcher had been Ruth Whitmore, wife of Charles Whitmore, the most respected banker in Cincinnati, Ohio. She had been the kind of woman people described as poised, as composed, as graciously subdued. She had worn good dresses and attended church on Sunday and hosted dinners on Friday evenings for Charles's business associates and their wives, and she had believed, with a sincerity that still humiliated her when she thought about it, that she was happy. The revelation of Charles's hidden motive had come on a Tuesday. It always seemed like the worst things happened on Tuesdays. She had gone to the bank to surprise him with a picnic lunch, something impulsive and uncharacteristic that she had decided to do because the spring morning was too beautiful to waste in her sitting room, and the secretary had let her upstairs without thinking, and she had opened the office door and found her husband standing over a ledger with a young woman named Dolers, a woman who was not reviewing accounts, but was instead doing something that left no room for misinterpretation. That had been the first betrayal. It had not been the last. In the weeks that followed, as the marriage collapsed and the lawyers arrived, and the social machinery of Cincinnati began its ruthless work of assigning blame, Ruth had discovered that the betrayal was older and wider than a single Tuesday morning. Charles had been involved with dolers for 3 years. He had also been quietly redirecting funds from several of their joint accounts into a separate account in his own name, preparing, apparently, for a departure that he had been planning longer than she had ever suspected. When the lawyers had finished their work, Ruth had been left with enough money to start over somewhere distant, and a divorce decree that the gossips of Cincinnati were already sharpening their teeth on. She had sold the house, packed 2 trunks and a carpet bag, and boarded a westbound train 3 days after the divorce was finalized. She had not told anyone where she was going because she did not yet know herself. She only knew that she needed distance. She needed the kind of distance that erased memory, that replaced familiar skylines with unfamiliar ones, that substituted the sound of a city she knew too well with the sound of wind across land, so vast it had no opinion of her whatsoever. She had come west to forget. What she had not anticipated was Roscoe Malone. The situation in the Silver Spur Saloon resolved itself within the next 20 minutes, though the resolution was tense and involved a great deal of shouting from the street outside and a brief standoff between Roscoe and a man named Harlan Briggs, who was the source of the entire problem. Harlan Briggs was a creditor of a particularly unscrupulous variety, the kind of man who lent money to desperate people and then charged interest rates that made repayment mathematically impossible. The kind of man whose business model was built not on being repaid, but on owning the collateral that desperate people put up when they signed his papers without reading them carefully enough. He had come to the Silver Spur that evening to collect on a debt that the saloon's owner, a man named Emmett Cruz, could not pay. Roscoe Malone, who was neither a regular at the saloon nor a man given to involving himself in other people's financial disputes, had been in the middle of his first whiskey when Briggs had walked in with 3 of his men and put a gun to Emmett's head, and something in Roscoe had simply refused to allow it. This, Ruth would learn later, was characteristic of Roscoe Malone. He was not a sheriff or a lawman of any official description. He was a rancher, the owner of a modest spread of land about 4 miles east of Red Rock called the Double M Ranch, where he ran cattle and horses and employed 3 hands and kept mostly to himself. He had no official obligation to involve himself in Emmett Cruz's problems, but Roscoe Malone operated by a code that had nothing to do with official obligation and everything to do with what he considered simply right, and watching a man get a gun put to his head over a debt that Harlan Briggs had deliberately structured to be unpayable struck him as wrong in a way he was incapable of ignoring. He had talked Briggs down from the immediate violence. He had not done it by negotiating or pleading. He had done it by standing up from his barstool with a quietness that was somehow more alarming than any amount of noise, laying his own revolver on the bar with a deliberate click, and looking at Harlan Briggs with those weathered oak eyes until Briggs's own eyes had slid away. "You want to point that gun at someone," Roscoe had said. "You point it at me, but you are going to want to think carefully about whether that is a road you are ready to go down tonight." Briggs had not been ready. He had been a bully, which meant he had the aggression of a man who was accustomed to being feared, but the instincts of a man who was accustomed to targeting people who could not fight back. Roscoe Malone did not look like someone who could not fight back. He looked, in fact, like someone who had been in enough real fights to be entirely unimpressed by the theatrical kind. By the time Ruth had walked through the door and the Roscoe's gun was out, not because he was threatening anyone but because Briggs had made another move and the room had shifted into something genuinely dangerous, the situation was already tipping toward its conclusion. Briggs left. His men left with him. Emmett Cruz sat down heavily on a stool and put his head in his hands and said something in Spanish that sounded like either a prayer or a profanity. And the women in the silk dresses began talking very loudly and quickly in the way that people do when the danger has passed and the body needs to release what it has been holding. Ruth stood against the wall where Roscoe had told her to stand, and she watched him holster his revolver with the economical movements of someone who had done it 10,000 times, and she thought that she should feel frightened. She had, after all, just walked into an armed standoff in a saloon in a town she had never heard of before today. But what she actually felt was something she could not immediately name, something that had more to do with the way Roscoe Malone had stood between a frightened man and a bully's gun than with anything that had happened to her personally. He turned and found her watching him. He looked slightly surprised to still find her there. "Stage broke down," she said before he could ask. "I need a place to stay tonight. The driver said there was a hotel." "There is," he said. "I will walk you over." "You do not need to do that." "No," he agreed. "But I will." The hotel was called the Redrock House, and it was a 2-story adobe building 3 blocks from the saloon, run by a woman named Mrs. Evangelina Portillo, who had a face like sun-hardened leather and eyes that missed nothing. She gave Ruth a room on the 2nd floor with a window that looked out over the main street, and a bed with a straw mattress and 2 wool blankets, and Ruth paid for 3 nights because the driver had said the wheel repair would take at least that long, and she sat on the edge of that bed in the fading light of a New Mexico evening and felt, for the first time in 3 months, something very faint and very tentative that might, if she let it, become the earliest beginning of peace. She did not let herself think about Roscoe Malone. She thought about him anyway. In the morning she dressed carefully, because careful dressing was one of the habits she had retained from her old life, the deliberate assembly of self before facing the world, and she went downstairs and found Mrs. Portillo serving breakfast in the small dining room off the lobby, eggs and salt pork and coffee so strong it was practically a solid, and she sat at the table nearest the window and watched the town of Redrock come awake. It was not a large town. There was the main street with its familiar Western arrangement of general store and livery and barber shop and assay office, the latter suggesting that there was some mining activity in the area, which would explain the particular roughness of some of the men she had seen the evening before. There was a small church at the far end of the street, whitewashed adobe with a simple wooden cross, and a schoolhouse beside it that looked like it might also serve as the church hall on Sundays. There were houses scattered behind the main street, some of them adobe, some of them raw timber, all of them speaking the particular language of people who had come here deliberately and were committed to staying. She was on her 2nd cup of coffee when Roscoe Malone walked in. He looked different in the morning light, less like a crisis and more like a man. He had cleaned up since the previous evening, his dark hair damp and combed, his jaw shaved close, and he was wearing a plain blue work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and canvas trousers and boots that had been recently polished if not recently purchased. He was perhaps 32 or 33, she thought, with the lean, sun-weathered build of someone who spent most of his days outdoors and the kind of stillness in his bearing that spoke of a man who had made peace with being alone. He saw her and paused. She thought for a moment that he might simply nod and take a different table, which was what she had half expected and perhaps half hoped. Instead, he crossed the room and stood at the edge of her table. "May I sit?" he asked. "It is a free country," she said, and then immediately felt the inadequacy of it because it was the sort of thing you said when you were trying not to say yes. He sat. Mrs. Portillo appeared from nowhere and poured him coffee without being asked, which told Ruth that he was not an infrequent visitor. He wrapped both hands around the mug and looked out the window at the same street she had been watching. "You all right?" he said. "After last night?" "I am fine," Ruth said. "I have discovered in recent months that I am considerably more difficult to rattle than I previously believed." He glanced at her sideways. "That's so. That is so. Where are you from?" She considered the question and its implications. "Ohio," she said. "Cincinnati. Long way from Cincinnati." "Yes," she said, "that was rather the point." He did not press it, which she appreciated. He drank his coffee and ate his breakfast when it arrived and spoke occasionally, not in the anxious, space-filling way of someone trying to make an impression, but in the easy, occasional way of someone who was comfortable with silence and used words when they had something to carry. He told her that the stage wheel would likely be repaired by day after tomorrow, that the blacksmith, a man named Augusto, was good at his work but thorough. He told her that if she needed anything from the general store, the owner, a widow named Clara Baines, was fair in her prices and did not cheat travelers. He did not tell her anything about himself, and she did not ask, and they parted after breakfast with a politeness that was friendly without being familiar. And Ruth walked the main street of Redrock and looked at the mountains to the north, and thought that there was something about this town that felt less temporary than she had expected. She spent the day exploring, which was something she had been doing in each town she passed through, not out of curiosity exactly, but out of the habit of her grief. The need to walk and move and put one foot in front of the other as a substitute for forward progress when forward progress was not yet possible. She visited the general store and bought thread and a small journal and a cake of soap, and Clara Baines was indeed fair and kind, and told her without being asked that the Redrock schoolhouse had been without a teacher for 4 months since the previous teacher had married a miner and moved to Silver City. Ruth filed that information away without examining it too carefully. She was sitting on the wooden bench outside the hotel in the early afternoon, writing in her new journal, when she became aware that someone was watching her. She looked up and found not Roscoe but a boy of perhaps 10, a slight dark-eyed boy with the kind of serious face that very old souls sometimes wear on very young people. He was standing in the street with a bucket in each hand, clearly having been interrupted mid-errand by some compulsion to stop and look at her. "Hello," Ruth said. "You are the lady from the stage," the boy said. "I am. Mr. Malone said you were from Ohio." Ruth blinked. "Mr. Malone talked about me. He mentioned it to my uncle this morning. My uncle owns the livery." The boy set one bucket down and transferred the other to his freed hand in a way that seemed designed to look casual. "Are you staying in Redrock?" "Only until the stage is repaired." The boy considered this. "That is what most people say," he told her, with the authority of someone who had been making philosophical observations about the transient nature of human intentions for decades. "And then some of them stay." He picked up his bucket and went on his way, and Ruth looked after him and then looked back at her journal and found she had nothing left to write. She saw Roscoe again that evening. This time it was not at the saloon, but at the edge of town, where the main street gave way to open land, and the light was turning everything the color of copper and gold. He was riding in from the direction of what she assumed was his ranch, on a bay horse with a long dark mane, and he pulled up when he saw her standing at the edge of the road with her shawl wrapped around her against the evening cool. "Miss Thatcher," he said. She had given her name as Thatcher at the hotel, reverting to her maiden name without even planning to, as if her body had known before her mind did that Ruth Whitmore no longer existed. "Mr. Malone." He dismounted and walked the horse, falling into step beside her with a natural ease that suggested he had not thought too hard about whether it was appropriate to do so. The horse was large and docile and smelled pleasantly of hay and leather. "How did you find the town?" he asked. "Smaller than I expected," she said. "More settled than I expected. I think I was expecting something wilder." "The territory is wild enough if you go looking for it," he said. "But most people who stay in towns like this one came out here looking for something quieter." "What did you come looking for?" she asked, and immediately felt the intrusion of it, because it was exactly the kind of question she would not have wanted anyone to ask her. But he did not seem offended. He was quiet for a moment, watching the road ahead rather than her. "Came out here about 8 years ago," he said. "From Texas originally. Spent a few years drifting, working cattle drives, that kind of thing. Found this land and thought it suited me." He paused. "I suppose I was looking for somewhere that felt like mine." "And does it feel like yours?" "It does now," he said. "Took a few years. Place does not feel like yours until you have put enough of yourself into it." They had reached the edge of the hotel, and he stopped and let her turn to face him. The copper light was falling across his face, and she could see the lines around his eyes and the set of his jaw and something in his expression that she recognized because she had seen it in her own mirror for the last 3 months, a person who was carrying something heavy and had learned to carry it without letting it show too much. "What are you running from?" he asked. His voice was quiet and there was no accusation in it. It was simply a question. She held his gaze. "Who says I am running?" "Woman comes west alone from Cincinnati with 2 trunks and won't say where she is going," he said. "That is either someone who is running or someone who is searching. And you have the look of a person who has lost something." The accuracy of it hit her somewhere behind the sternum. "Both," she said finally. "Running from something and searching for something. I'm not yet sure what the second thing is." He nodded as if she had confirmed something he had already suspected. "Well," he said, "you have time enough to figure it out, I expect." He touched the brim of his hat. "Good evening, Miss Thatcher." He led his horse to the livery, and Ruth went inside and stood in the small lobby of the Redrock house and pressed her palm flat against the wall because she needed to feel something solid. That conversation had cost her more than she had expected. Not because it had been painful, because it had not been. The stage did not leave on the expected day. Augusto the blacksmith, having disassembled the wheel, discovered that the problem was not only the broken spoke he had been told about but also a hairline crack in the iron rim that made the entire wheel unsound, and replacing it properly required a part that would need to come from Las Cruces on the next supply run, which was 3 days away. The stage driver, a weary man named Peterson who had clearly been through worse, announced this to his 4 passengers with the resignation of someone who had long since made peace with the fact that the West did not operate on schedules. Ruth paid for another week at the Redrock house. The other 3 passengers cursed loudly and paid for nothing because they had family in town to stay with, which made Ruth feel both aware of her solitude and oddly relieved to be free of the obligation to be social with people she had been sitting next to for 3 days. She had a week. A week was, she decided, enough time to look carefully at a place, enough time to understand whether it was somewhere a person could live rather than merely pass through. She went back to see Clara Baines at the general store. "The schoolhouse," she said. "You mentioned it has been without a teacher." Clara Baines, who was a small, sharp-featured woman with reading spectacles perpetually pushed to the top of her head, looked at Ruth with an assessing directness that Ruth had come to associate with women who had built their own lives in difficult circumstances and had no patience for anything unclear. "4 months," she confirmed. 12 children who are currently running as wild as rabbits and driving their mothers to distraction. Who would I speak to about the position?" Clara's mouth curved. "I would speak to myself if I were you," she said. "I am on the town committee, as is Evangeline Portillo and Deputy Raines. I suspect we could have a conversation before sundown today if you are seriously considering it." "I am seriously considering it," Ruth said, and it was only as she said it that she realized how true it was. The committee met that evening at Mrs. Portillo's kitchen table, and Ruth answered their questions directly and honestly, telling them that she had a good education, that she had taught Sunday school and tutored children in Cincinnati, that she was a divorced woman, which she said plainly, watching their faces, and the faces did not change in any way that indicated catastrophe, which told her something important about this particular committee. They offered her a salary of $22 a month and a small room attached to the back of the schoolhouse that had previously been used for storage and would require some cleaning. She accepted both. She went back to the hotel and sat on her bed and thought about what she had just done. She had arrived in Redrock by accident because a wheel had broken. She had meant to be in Santa Fe by now, anonymous in a larger city, a person without connections or history. Instead, she was about to become the school teacher of a small New Mexico town, known by name to every family in the community, committed to a life that was not anonymous at all. She thought about the boy with the buckets, who had said that most people said they were only staying temporarily, and then some of them stayed. She thought about the mountains to the north, which were extraordinary. She thought about a man with weathered oak eyes who had not pressed her for information she was not ready to give. She did not ask herself whether any of those thoughts were related. The first 2 weeks of teaching were chaotic in the particular way that classrooms with mixed-age students and no established routine are chaotic, which is to say energetically, loudly, and with a kind of exuberant disorganization that was either endearing or exhausting depending on the hour. There were 12 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, the children of ranchers and miners and shopkeepers, some of whom had had previous schooling, and some of whom had not, and Ruth spent the first week simply assessing what each of them knew and what they needed to know and constructing in her mind the shape of what the next several months should look like. She found that she was good at it, better than she had remembered. In Cincinnati, she had tutored her neighbors' children as a favor, a pleasant way to spend an afternoon, nothing she had thought of as a skill or a vocation. But here, facing 12 pairs of eyes that ranged from bored to hungry to suspicious, she found something in herself that wanted to rise to the occasion. She found that she had strong opinions about what children needed to learn and how they needed to learn it, and that expressing those opinions through action rather than through the social niceties that had governed her previous life was intensely satisfying. The boy with the buckets turned out to be named Felix, and he was not, in fact, 10 years old but 12, which she discovered when she reviewed her enrollment list. He was one of her sharpest students, the kind of mind that ate information and immediately started asking what it connected to, and she quickly identified him as someone who would bore quickly if she did not push him. Roscoe Malone came to the school at the end of her second week, not as a parent because he had no children, but because he had heard, through whatever social mechanism small towns use to distribute information, that the new teacher had reorganized the school calendar, and he wanted to know whether it would conflict with the planting schedule, since several of his ranch hands' children were enrolled, and he wanted to be sure they could still be pulled for the heavy work in spring. It was a practical question, and she gave him a practical answer, and they stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse and discussed logistics with a brisk efficiency that was itself a kind of intimacy, the intimacy of two people treating each other as capable adults with things to manage. When the practical question was settled, he stayed in the doorway for another moment, looking at the cleaned and reorganized room, the maps she had pinned to the wall and the careful rows of slates and the small bookshelf she had assembled from a collection of donated volumes. "You settled in fast," he said. It was not a criticism. There was something in it that sounded almost like approval. "I have had practice these past months in settling quickly," she said. "One becomes efficient at it." He looked at her steadily. "Seems to me you might have stopped running." She considered denying it. "Seems that way to me too," she said. "I am not entirely sure what to make of that." "Sometimes," he said, "the wheel breaking is not an accident." She did not know how to answer that, so she said nothing. And he nodded once and put his hat back on and walked toward his horse. And Ruth stood in the doorway of her school and watched him go and felt something opening in her chest like a window that had been stuck for a very long time and had finally been pushed free. It happened slowly after that, the way things that matter tend to happen, not in a single dramatic moment but in accumulation, in the layering of small encounters that each left a deposit of warmth behind. He brought her firewood in late October without being asked, appearing at the schoolhouse door on a Saturday morning with 2 of his ranch hands and a wagon full of split pine, and they stacked it against the side of the building while she made coffee. And when they were done, he sat on the school's front step and drank the coffee and told her about the ranching operation, the cattle he was building up and the horses he preferred, and the problem he was having with the northern fence line. She told him in return about the curriculum she was developing and the ongoing battle she was having with Felix's restlessness and the girl she was concerned about, a 9-year-old named Maria whose attention drifted in ways that suggested she might have difficulty with her vision. They talked the way people talk when they are genuinely interested in each other's lives, not to impress or to persuade, but because what the other person was doing seemed real and worth understanding. She noticed that he listened with his full attention, not scanning the horizon or fidgeting, just present with what she was saying in a way that made her want to say more. "You are different than I expected when you first walked in," he said finally. "What did you expect?" He thought about it. Someone passing through, someone using Redrock as a rest stop. He looked at his coffee. "I did not expect someone who would look at a storage room attached to a schoolhouse and see a place to live." "The storage room cleaned up quite well," she said mildly. "It is 14 by 12 feet. It has a window." He smiled at that. It was the first full smile she had seen from him, unguarded and quick, and it changed his face entirely, softened the lines around his mouth and put light behind the weathered oak of his eyes, and Ruth felt something shift in her with a swiftness and a force that startled her. She looked away quickly, back at her own coffee, and told herself firmly that she was not ready for this, that she had come west to forget, and that whatever this was, it was not the kind of thing a woman in her position should be leaning toward. But the feeling did not care what she told it. November arrived with a cold snap that turned the mountains north of Redrock into something from a painting, the peaks capped with white, and the lower slopes blazing with the yellow of late-season cottonwoods. The desert air had a clarity to it that Ruth had never experienced anywhere else, a transparency that made distances deceptive and sunsets violent. She had taken to walking in the evenings when the light was doing its spectacular things, and she was not surprised when, after the third or fourth evening walk, Roscoe fell into step beside her as naturally as if they had arranged it. They talked during those walks. They talked about everything and nothing. They talked about books, which surprised her because she had not expected him to be a reader, and he laughed when she said so and told her that she had some peculiar ideas about ranchers. He had a shelf of books in his ranch house, he said, mostly history and some natural philosophy, and a few novels he had been given and read because they were there. She told him about the books she had grown up with, the Dickens and the Brontes and the histories her father had pressed on her, and he listened with genuine interest and told her about a novel he had read called Ben-Hur, which had only been published a few years prior and which had made a considerable impression on him. She told him about Cincinnati, gradually, in the way that you tell someone about a wound once you have decided to trust them, carefully and in pieces. She told him about the marriage, not with bitterness but with the clear-eyed assessment of someone who had processed the worst of it and come out the other side. She told him about the betrayal, and about the humiliation of realizing that the life she had thought she was living had been, in some fundamental way, a fiction she had been the last to know. He listened without interrupting, without offering the kinds of unsolicited wisdom that men often offered women in pain. He only said, when she had finished, "You were not foolish. You trusted someone who was not trustworthy. Those are different things." "It feels the same from the inside," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "Do you?" He was quiet for a long moment, watching the sunset paint the desert floor. "I had a partner," he said finally. "A man I brought out here with me from Texas 4 years ago. We were going to work the double M together, split the profits, expand the herd." He stopped. "He was selling my cattle to a buyer in Silver City and pocketing the money for 2 years before I found out. By the time I did, half of what I had built was gone." "What happened to him?" Ruth asked. "He left before I could do anything about it," Roscoe said. "Took what he had accumulated and cleared out in the night." He exhaled. "I spent a year being angrier than I had ever been in my life, angry at him, angry at myself for not seeing it. And then I started rebuilding and I realized that being angry was costing me more than he had taken." "So you let it go?" "I let most of it go," he said. "Kept the lesson." She thought about that. Kept the lesson. Let the rest go. She had been trying to let the rest go for 3 months now, with varying degrees of success. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes she woke in the night with the full weight of it back on her chest like a stone. "Does it get easier?" she asked. It was as honest a question as she had ever asked anyone. He looked at her, and there was a gentleness in his expression that had nothing to do with pity. "It gets quieter," he said. "And one day you realize you have gone several hours without thinking about it, and then a few days, and eventually it is just something that happened, not something that is happening." She nodded. She believed him. What surprised her, standing in the desert dark with the stars beginning to appear above the mountains, was that she also realized she had not thought about Charles Whitmore in 2 full days. She had been thinking about Roscoe Malone instead. December came, and with it the social life of a small western town during the holiday season, which turned out to be considerably livelier than Ruth had expected. There was a dance at the town hall on the first Saturday of the month, a genuine affair with a fiddle player brought over from a neighboring ranch, and a caller who did his job with more enthusiasm than accuracy. Ruth was invited by Mrs. Portillo and attended in her best dress, a deep green wool that was perhaps slightly too fine for a New Mexico Territory dance, but which made her feel, for the first time in many months, like herself rather than like the shadow of herself. Roscoe was there. Of course he was there. It was a small town. He asked her to dance with a straightforwardness that she was beginning to recognize as characteristic, not a prolonged approach or a carefully constructed social maneuver. He simply came and stood beside her and said, "Would you like to dance?" And she said yes, and they danced. He was, it turned out, a good dancer. She had not expected that either. He moved with the same economy and sureness he brought to everything else, nothing wasted, everything placed exactly where it needed to be. She was, she knew, a good dancer herself. It was one of the things her Cincinnati upbringing had drilled into her, and dancing with someone who was equally competent was a different experience from dancing with someone who was making an effort. There was no effort between them. There was just the music and the movement and the warmth of his hand at her waist, and the fact that she realized with a start, smiling so genuinely that her cheeks ached with it. "You look like you are enjoying yourself," he said. The observation had a note of pleased surprise in it. "I am," she said. "It has been a while since I could say that without qualifying it." The fiddle player shifted into a slower piece, and around them couples drifted into more conversational proximity, and Roscoe looked down at her with those steady eyes that she had been studying for nearly 2 months now, and she thought, "This is the man who could make me want to remember. Not forget. Remember. Remember what it felt like to trust someone, to look forward to something, to wake in the morning and feel the day arriving as an opportunity rather than an obstacle." The thought frightened her enough that she looked away. Later that evening, after the dance had wound down and people were gathering coats and saying their good nights, Harlan Briggs reappeared. He came through the door of the town hall with 2 men she did not recognize, and a manner that radiated deliberate menace, the manner of someone who had come not for a dance but to deliver a message. The message was for Emmett Cruz, who was present and who visibly paled when Briggs walked in. But Briggs, after a moment of looking around the room, let his gaze settle on Roscoe instead, and the look between them was the look of a long, unresolved account. "Malone," Briggs said. "Briggs," Roscoe said. He had not moved. He was still standing near Ruth, but there was a shift in him, subtle and total, like a landscape when a cloud passes over the sun. Everything the same and everything different. "We have unfinished business," Briggs said. "That debt of Cruz's is cleared," Roscoe said flatly. Ruth blinked. She had not known about this. "I cleared it 3 weeks ago. You have been paid in full and you know it." The room had gone very quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something that has been building finally surfaces. Briggs's face did something complicated. It was the face of a man who had wanted a financial dispute but had received charity instead, and who knew that the second was, in the social calculus of a small western town, far more damaging to him than the first. He looked at Roscoe with an expression that had curdled past anger into something uglier. "This is not over," he said. "Yes," Roscoe said quietly, "it is." Briggs left. The room breathed again. Emmett Cruz crossed the floor and shook Roscoe's hand with a grip that communicated more than words, and Roscoe accepted it without theater. Ruth was beside him when it was over, and she said quietly, because she needed to understand, "You paid his debt." "I did." "Why?" He met her eyes. "Because I could, and because Emmett Cruz is a good man who got into a bad agreement when he was desperate, and because men like Briggs only have the power that people like us let them have." She stood very still. "That is an extraordinary thing to do for someone." "It was not extraordinary," he said. "It was just right." She thought of what she had felt the first night when she had watched him stand between a frightened man and a bully's gun. She thought that she had known something then, some preliminary version of what she was feeling now, and that she had not been wrong. She had simply not been ready to name it yet. She was not ready yet, but she was closer. Christmas in Raydrock was a simple, genuine affair. The church was decorated with juniper branches, and the children of the school performed a brief nativity play that Felix stage managed with an authoritarian efficiency that Ruth found both impressive and mildly alarming given his age. There were dinners and small gifts exchanged, and a general atmosphere of warmth that had nothing to do with the external temperature, which in the desert winter fell sharply at night and left frost on the windows that Ruth found beautiful in a way she had never found Cincinnati frost beautiful. Roscoe came to the school's nativity play. He sat in the back row with his hat in his hands and watched with a quiet attention that made her notice him, even when she was trying to manage 12 children in various states of costume malfunction. When it was over and the parents were collecting their children and congratulating each other, he found her at the back of the room and handed her something wrapped in brown paper. "Merry Christmas," he said. She opened it carefully. It was a book. A fine one, well bound, the cloth spine dark blue. She looked at the title and felt something seize in her chest. It was a collection of the letters of Abigail Adams, published the previous year, a woman who had built a life and a mind and a partnership in circumstances that required extraordinary strength. She looked up at him. "How did you know?" she said. "Clara ordered it in for me," he said. "She said you had mentioned admiring Abigail Adams when you were in the store." He had asked Clara Baines what book she might like. He had ordered it in. He had done this quietly and without announcement, and had waited for the right moment to give it to her. And he was standing there now with his hat in his hands, looking not at all like a man who was waiting to be thanked, but simply like a man who had wanted to give her something that suited her. And Ruth felt tears press at the back of her eyes and absolutely refused to let them come. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was steady. "This is the most thoughtful thing anyone has given me in a very long time." He nodded. "You are welcome," he said, and there was a plainness to it that was worth more than poetry. She had a gift for him, too, something she had made herself in the evenings when the schoolhouse was quiet and her fingers needed occupation. She had embroidered a handkerchief, a small and private labor that she now produced from her pocket with slightly less composure than she would have preferred. He took it and looked at it. It was plain work, initials in dark blue thread, his initials RM, with a small pattern of horses running along the border. He was quiet for a moment, turning it over in his hands. "You made this," he said. "I had the evenings," she said. He looked up at her, and something in his expression was different. Not softer exactly, but more open, as if a door that had been keeping itself properly closed had leaned slightly ajar. "Thank you, Ruth," he said. It was the first time he had used her first name. She registered it like a small detonation. The new year, 1884, arrived with a windstorm that stripped the leaves from the few trees in Raydrock's Main Street and sent dust sheeting across the desert floor in great red curtains. Ruth lay in her small room behind the schoolhouse and listened to the wind working at the walls and felt strangely secure, the security of something that had put down enough root to hold against weather. January was also the month that Harlan Briggs made his real move. The incident with the dance had not ended the matter. Briggs was not the kind of man who accepted a public defeat gracefully, and his animosity toward Roscoe had deepened from a business grievance into something personal and festering. What Ruth did not know, and what would be revealed to her in the hard way that things are revealed when someone has been keeping secrets, was that Briggs had already tried and failed to acquire the land immediately to the south of the Double M Ranch. Land that, if it ever came up for sale, would give whoever owned it control of the primary water source for the surrounding ranches. Roscoe's ranch sat on the upstream side of that water. Briggs had been trying for 2 years to get between Roscoe and that land, and Roscoe, who understood the territory's geography and its politics with equal clarity, had been his primary obstacle. Briggs's new strategy involved Ruth. She became aware of it on a Tuesday, which seemed fitting. She was walking back from a supply run to the general store, her arms full, when 2 of Briggs's men stepped out of the alley beside the assay office. They did not threaten her physically. They were far more sophisticated than that. They informed her, with a politeness that was itself a form of menace, that Mr. Briggs had heard she was a divorced woman from back east with no family in the territory and no real ties to the community, and that he had a proposition for her. The proposition, delivered through these intermediaries with an unctuousness that made Ruth's skin crawl, was this: Briggs would arrange for the school's funding to be cut if Ruth did not use her relationship with Roscoe Malone to encourage him to reconsider his position on the southern land sale. She stood in the cold January sun and looked at these 2 men and felt something harden in her with an anger that was colder and cleaner than anything she had felt since Cincinnati. "Tell Mr. Briggs," she said, "that if he comes near my school or my students or me again, I will go to the deputy sheriff, and then I will write personally to the territorial governor, and I will be very specific about his business practices." She paused. "I have been very quiet since I arrived here. I would like to remain quiet, but I am not without resources, and I am not, as Mr. Briggs appears to believe, without courage." She walked away before they could respond. Her hands were shaking slightly inside her coat. She had not told Roscoe. She told Roscoe that evening. She had thought about not telling him. She had thought briefly about handling it herself and presenting him with a resolved situation rather than an ongoing problem. But she had done that kind of alone management for too many years in Cincinnati, the management of complications without burdening the other person, the smoothing over of difficulties so as not to create friction, and she recognized it now as one of the habits of a marriage that had asked her to be small. Roscoe was not Charles. She did not need to protect him from the truth. She knocked on the door of the Double M Ranch house, which she had never visited before, and he answered it with an expression of surprise that shifted almost immediately into something more alert. She told him everything, plainly and in order. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and the quietness was not the quietness of a man suppressing anger but the quietness of a man thinking carefully. "I should have told you about the land situation earlier," he said. "Why didn't you?" "Because I did not want to bring my problems to your door." She felt a complicated recognition in that. "That is exactly what I almost did," she said. "Kept this from you." He looked at her. "But you didn't." "No," she said, "I did not." They stood in the lamplight of his doorway, and something shifted between them with the finality of something that has been held in tension long enough and has finally resolved into its true position. "Come inside," he said. "It is cold and we need to talk about what we are going to do." His ranch house was exactly what she might have imagined if she had allowed herself to imagine it, which she had been careful not to do. It was spare and practical and clean, with the bookshelf he had mentioned, and a large stone fireplace burning steadily, and a kitchen table with 2 chairs that looked like they had been occupied by serious conversation on many previous evenings. There were no feminine touches, nothing decorative, but neither was it the cluttered bachelor disorder she might have expected. It was the home of someone who valued order and did not require ornament. He made coffee and they sat at the table and talked through the situation with the shared pragmatic seriousness that she was coming to love about him. The way he approached a problem as something to be solved rather than lamented, the way he treated her thinking as equal to his rather than supplementary. They decided together to go to Deputy Raines in the morning. They decided to let the committee know. They decided that Ruth would write a formal letter documenting everything Briggs's men had said, dated, and witnessed, to be kept on record. Roscoe would speak to his attorney in Las Cruces about the land situation and about Briggs's business practices more broadly. None of it was dramatic or heroic. It was simply two people who had been wronged deciding that they would not accept being maneuvered into silence. It was, Ruth thought, the most adult and the most genuinely equal conversation she had ever had about a threat to her safety. When the coffee was finished and the plan was made, she should have left. It was late and the night was cold and the propriety of the situation was clear. But she did not move immediately, and neither did he, and they sat in the warmth of the firelight with the empty cups on the table between them, and the silence was the kind of silence that is full rather than empty. "I need to say something," Roscoe said. She waited. "I am not good at this," he said. "At whatever this is between us. I'm not a man who says things easily." He looked at his hands, then at her. "But I think you should know that in the 8 years I have lived on this land in this town, I have never once hoped that a stage would break down." She felt warmth spread through her chest like sunrise. "Until now," she said softly. "Until now," he said. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand and held hers, and they sat like that in the quiet of the Double M Ranch house, while the fire burned and the wind worked at the walls, and the night settled around them like something that knew what it was doing. It was not a kiss. It was not a declaration. It was two damaged people choosing, with full awareness of the risk, to trust. It was enough for now. It was more than enough. The matter with Briggs reached its resolution in February, and the resolution was satisfying in the way that resolutions are satisfying when they involve a combination of legal process and community solidarity. Roscoe's attorney in Las Cruces had been investigating Briggs's lending practices for some time on behalf of another client, and Ruth's documented account of the coercion attempt provided exactly the kind of additional evidence that shifted the attorney's case from solid to overwhelming. Deputy Raines, who had his own file of complaints against Briggs that he had been building carefully, was ready to act. Harlan Briggs was served with legal papers on a Wednesday morning in the main street of Raydrock, in view of half the town, and he left the territory before the month was out. His properties were put into receivership. Several of his debtors, including Emmett Cruz, found their obligations significantly reduced or eliminated when the fraudulent components of their original agreements were examined in the legal light they deserved. Raydrock, in the aftermath, felt lighter. Ruth had noticed that a town with a bully in it carries a weight that everyone adjusts to without fully recognizing until it is removed. And the removal of Briggs from the social equation of Raydrock was like the removal of a stone from a boot that everyone had been walking on for so long they had stopped noticing the limp. She celebrated by giving her students an unscheduled holiday and taking them on a nature walk into the desert hills north of town, which was partly educational and partly because Felix had been vibrating with barely contained energy for 2 weeks, and she judged that everyone needed to walk several miles in fresh air before she could get any useful work done in the classroom. Roscoe came with them, which had not been planned but which seemed natural once it happened. He walked at the back of the group and answered the questions the children directed at him about the land and the plants and the animals with a patience and a specificity that told Ruth he genuinely liked children, even though he did not seem to have actively sought their company before. Felix attached himself to Roscoe's side for most of the walk and pelted him with questions about the ranch with the focused intensity of a boy who had decided an adult was worth knowing. "He reminds me of myself at that age," Roscoe told her afterward when they were walking back to town with the children ahead of them, tired and content. "Relentlessly curious and slightly impossible to manage," Ruth said. "Exactly," he said, and there was that smile again, the one that changed his face entirely. He needs more challenge than I can provide in a general curriculum, Ruth said. I have been thinking about writing to a school in Santa Fe about whether he might sit for an examination at some point. He is the kind of mind that should go to a proper academy. Does his family have the means for that? His uncle at the livery is not wealthy. But Felix's father sent money from Arizona when Felix's mother died, and his uncle holds it in trust. She paused. I would need to have a conversation with the uncle and with the committee about whether the town might contribute to a scholarship. Roscoe was quiet for a moment. Put together what you need, he said. The double M will contribute something. She looked at him. You do not have to do that. I know I do not have to, he said. I want to. She thought about the word want in his mouth and what it had started to contain. She thought about how long it had been since someone's wanting had been directed generously and honestly at her. She thought that she had spent 3 months trying to forget a life that had taught her that wanting from another person was dangerous, and that what this man's wanting felt like was the precise opposite of dangerous. It felt like safety. Not the safety of walls and locks, but the safety of someone standing next to you who is facing the same direction. In March, the first true warmth returned to the desert, and the hills north of Ridge Rock turned briefly, improbably green, and Ruth Thatcher, who had come west in the autumn with 2 trunks and a determination to disappear, found that she had instead become entirely visible. She was woven into the fabric of the town, known by every child in the schoolhouse and every parent who brought them, addressed by name in the street by people whose names she also knew, invited to dinners and committee meetings and church events, and the small ceremonies of community life that she had, in Cincinnati, participated in as a performance of social participation, and that she now participated in as a genuine member. She had put herself into the place, and the place had responded. She was thinking about this on a warm March evening, when Roscoe arrived at the schoolhouse door not with firewood or a practical question, but with 2 horses saddled and ready. I want to show you something, he said. She had been in the saddle enough times since arriving in the territory. She had borrowed a horse from the livery on several occasions for the kind of riding that the open desert required if you wanted to see it properly, that she could manage the ride without difficulty. She mounted the horse he had brought for her, a gentle gray mare who had a smooth gait and an excellent temperament, and they rode east out of town toward the Double M, but he did not stop at the ranch house. He rode past it, past the cattle pastures and the horse paddock and the bunkhouse where a lamp was burning in the window, and up a gentle rise to the east of the main buildings. And when they reached the top of the rise he stopped, and she stopped beside him, and she understood why he had brought her here. The land spread out below them in the last light of the day, the ranch and the town in the middle distance, the desert floor extending north and south, and to the west the sky was doing something extraordinary, the kind of sunset that the territory specialized in, bands of color so deep and saturated that they looked painted by someone who had not been told to exercise restraint. The mountains caught the last light on their peaks and held it, burning gold and rose against the darkening blue above. I come up here when something has gone wrong, he said, and when something has gone right. It has a way of making both things the same size. She looked out at it and felt the 3 months she had spent running from her own past dissolving behind her, the pain of it becoming the thing it needed to become, part of the story rather than the whole of it, the price paid to arrive here to this hill, next to this man in this extraordinary fading light. I am glad the wheel broke, she said. She felt him turn to look at her. Ruth, he said, just her name. She turned to face him on the ridge above the ranch, with the sunset burning behind her and the desert stretching out in every direction, and the whole enormous western sky as witness, and she said the thing she had been not saying for 4 months with a directness that would have startled the woman she used to be. I think I am falling in love with you, Roscoe Malone. I want you to know that I am frightened by it, and that I am choosing it anyway. He looked at her for a long moment with those eyes that she had been studying since the night she had walked into the Silver Spur with a desert sunset at her back and his gun pointing at her chest. And then he crossed the small distance between them and cupped her face in both hands, his calloused rancher's hands, warm from the last of the sun, and he kissed her with all the quiet sureness that was the most characteristic thing about him. When he drew back, he said, "I have been in love with you since you told me you had 2 trunks and a plan to disappear and looked like you might just disappear anyway if I watched you wrong." She laughed, which she had not entirely expected. That was the second day. "I know," he said. "I am aware it is not respectable. I think," she said, "you will find I have become considerably less concerned with respectable." He kissed her again, and the horses stood patient, and the sunset burned itself out behind the mountains, and Ruth Thatcher, who had come west to forget, understood that what she had found was not oblivion but its opposite. She had found, in the last place she had expected to look for it, the thing that made her want every memory of every step that had led here, because each step, including the ones that had broken her, had been necessary to arrive at this precise, luminous moment. Spring in New Mexico territory was a thing of extravagant beauty and practical demands. Roscoe was deep in the work of the ranch, the calving and the fence repairs, and the planning for the summer cattle drive, and Ruth was deep in the school year's final push, preparing her students for their year-end examinations, with a focus that her students alternately appreciated and resented. But they found each other in the margins of every day, in the early morning coffee on the schoolhouse step, and the evening rides and the Sunday dinners that Roscoe had begun cooking at the ranch house on the assumption, which proved accurate, that Ruth preferred his cooking to eating alone. He was, it turned out, a good cook in the direct, unfussy way of someone who had been feeding himself and his hands for years, and had developed competence out of pure practical necessity. He made things like beef stew with dried chilies and cornbread baked in the Dutch oven, and coffee kept warm on the stove. And Ruth ate everything he put in front of her with the appetite of a woman who had been running for a long time and had finally stopped. She learned the ranch. Not formally, not because it was required, but because she was genuinely curious, and because understanding the land he worked was a way of understanding him, of reading the text that was Roscoe Malone by reading the place he had put himself into. She learned which pastures were best for which cattle, and where the water ran, and where the fence line had its weaknesses, and the names of the 3 hands, a quiet, hard-working man named Diego and 2 brothers named Thomas and Will, who were 19 and 21, and had the energy of people who had not yet learned that the world was capable of disappointing them. Diego in particular she liked. He had been with Roscoe for 4 years, had survived the discovery of the partner's betrayal and helped Roscoe rebuild in its aftermath, and he had a steadiness and a loyalty that were immediately evident. He treated her with a respectful warmth that told her he had decided she was trustworthy, which she took as a significant endorsement. In April, she wrote to her sister Alina in Columbus, Ohio, the first communication she had made with anyone from her former life since she had left. The letter was 3 pages long, and it told Alina, honestly and without apology, where she was and what she was doing and how she was. It did not minimize or explain away the divorce. It did not ask permission or forgiveness. It simply laid out the facts of Ruth Thatcher's life in Red Rock, New Mexico territory, and included in the final paragraph a mention of Roscoe Malone and a sentence that read, "I am happy, Alina. I did not know if I would be able to say that again, and I want you to know that I can." The letter she received back 3 weeks later was 4 pages, and contained a great deal of concern expressed in the particular way that Alina always expressed concern, which was by asking extensive practical questions that were really emotional questions wearing practical clothes. By the last page, Alina's practical questions had softened into something more honest, and the final paragraph read, "Tell me more about this man with the ranch and the weathered eyes. He sounds, from everything you have described, like exactly the kind of person you deserve and absolutely nothing like what you have previously chosen. Right soon." Ruth laughed until she had tears on her face, sitting at the kitchen table of the schoolhouse, and wrote back that very evening. In May, Roscoe asked her to marry him. He did not do it dramatically, which was both characteristic and appropriate. He did it on a Sunday afternoon when they were sitting on the front step of the ranch house watching the late spring light on the mountains, with coffee cups in hand and the sound of Diego and the brothers working somewhere in the near distance. And he said, without preamble, because he had never been a man for preamble, "I want you to stay, Ruth, not at the Redrock house or in the schoolhouse. Here. I want to build a life with you properly and officially if you are willing." She looked at him. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I am." She looked back at the mountains. She thought about Cincinnati, which felt now like something that had happened to someone she used to know, not with coldness or disconnection, but with the settled distance of something that has become fully the past. She thought about what it meant to choose, not from the pressure of expectation or the assumption of inevitability, but from genuine desire, freely felt and freely expressed. She thought about the things she had told herself she did not want any more because wanting them had cost her too much. She thought about how wrong she had been, not about wanting, but about what she had been aiming her wanting at. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Roscoe, I am willing." He set his coffee cup down and took both of her hands in his and looked at her with an expression that she would spend the rest of her life being grateful for, an expression that was simple and unguarded and entirely, unambiguously happy. "Good," he said. "Good," she agreed. They were married in June, in the whitewashed adobe church at the end of Redrock's Main Street, on a Saturday morning when the desert was in full summer, and the sky was the deep, irreducible blue that the territory saved for its best days. Mrs. Portillo organized the reception with the thoroughness of a military campaign and somewhat more decorative enthusiasm. The church hall was hung with paper flowers made by Ruth's students, and the tables were laden with food contributed by what seemed to be every family in town. Felix served as the unexpected master of ceremonies, a role he had not been officially assigned, but had assumed with his characteristic authority, directing the smaller children with a firm hand, and managing the logistics of the reception with a competence that made Ruth look at him and think, not for the first time, that the world was going to need to be ready for Felix when he arrived in it fully. Ruth wore a dress that Clara Baines had helped her make from fabric ordered from Santa Fe, a dove-gray silk that was simple and beautiful, and she carried desert wildflowers that she and Mrs. Portillo had gathered in the hills that morning. And she stood at the altar of the small adobe church and looked at Roscoe Malone, who was in his best dark suit and looking mildly uncomfortable in it in the way that a man looks when a suit is an unusual item, and she thought, "This is not forgetting. This is the opposite of forgetting. This is the thing that gives shape to everything that came before." The betrayal and the humiliation and the long months of desert roads and broken wheels and fresh starts, all of it arranged now in retrospect into the particular shape of a journey that had been going somewhere specific after all, even when it had not known its own destination. Deputy Raines, who had a secondary qualification as a justice of the peace, presided with a solemnity that was only slightly undercut by the fact that he had a piece of cake paper in his hand, from having arrived early and been unable to resist Mrs. Portillo's baking. The vows they exchanged were the traditional ones, the words worn smooth with use, but they meant them, both of them, with a precision that the traditional words sometimes acquire when the people saying them have earned the right to say them through the harder lessons. When it was done and they were married, and the church erupted in the particular noise that small western towns make when they are celebrating one of their own, Roscoe leaned close and said quietly, for only her ears, "Ruth Malone." She tried the sound of it in her mind. Ruth Malone. Ruth Thatcher Malone, she decided, keeping both, because she had rebuilt herself once already in the territory of her own full name and was not inclined to let any part of it go. "Roscoe Malone," she replied, equally quietly. "You have made a very consequential error in marrying a schoolteacher." "And what error is that?" "I will correct your grammar for the rest of your life." He laughed, the full, unguarded laugh that she had been collecting instances of since December, and which she fully intended to spend decades accumulating more of. He put his arm around her and they walked out of the church into the full, blazing New Mexico summer, and the town of Redrock cheered around them, and somewhere at the front of the crowd, a 12-year-old boy with the serious face of a very old soul was standing on a chair to see better and clapping with an enthusiasm that was entirely out of character, and therefore entirely dear. The first year of the marriage was full and good. Ruth continued teaching, which the committee accepted without question and which was, she had made clear before the wedding, not a subject for negotiation. Roscoe had not attempted to negotiate it. He had, in fact, told her that a Redrock without her as its teacher was a lesser Redrock, and that the children would have something to say about it, which had made her feel both seen and slightly overwhelmed. She moved into the ranch house, which meant that the small room behind the schoolhouse went back to being a storage room, though a much better organized one, and she rode to school each morning on the gray mare, who she had named Patience in a fit of either irony or aspiration she was not entirely sure about. The domestic arrangements of the Double M were adjusted to accommodate two people rather than one, which involved primarily the addition of curtains and a second reading chair by the fire and a kitchen garden that Ruth planted behind the house with seeds sent from a leaner in Columbus, along with a letter that contained the phrase, "I trust the curtains are not too civilizing," with a precision that suggested Eleanor had not changed at all. In October, Ruth told Roscoe she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen, on a Tuesday evening over dinner. She had planned something more elaborate, but the moment had arrived with its own timing and she had simply said it, looking up from her plate. "I am going to have a baby, in the spring, I think." He put his fork down and looked at her across the table. The lamplight was warm between them and the fire was going in the other room, and outside the desert night was doing its vast, quiet thing. "In the spring," he repeated. "April or May, I believe." He stood up from the table and crossed to her and pulled her up from her chair and held her, both arms around her, and he did not say anything for a long moment, and she held him back and felt his heart beating under her hand, and thought that she had forgotten this too, in Cincinnati, had forgotten or never known what it meant to be held by someone whose holding was entirely about her and not at all about themselves. "Are you well?" he said finally, pulling back to look at her. "I am perfectly well," she said, "slightly nauseated in the mornings, but otherwise entirely well." He continued looking at her with an expression she could only describe as reverent, which was not a word she would have previously associated with Roscoe Malone and which suited him perfectly. "A baby," he said. "Yes," she said, "a baby." He sat back down and picked up his fork and then put it down again and looked at her some more, and she began to laugh, softly, at the quality of his distraction. And after a moment he laughed too, and they sat at the kitchen table of the Double M Ranch house in the warm October evening and laughed together, which was, she thought, exactly the right response to the arrival of something that large and that good. She wrote to Eleanor that night, and Eleanor's reply, arriving 3 weeks later, contained so many exclamation marks that Ruth had to count them out of curiosity. There were 14. The pregnancy was uncomplicated, and the territory's open air and active life proved excellent for it. Ruth taught until February, which was 2 months before the baby was due, and her students received this announcement with the divided response she had expected. The older ones genuinely concerned about having a replacement teacher, the younger ones primarily fascinated by the logistical aspects of having a pregnant teacher, and asking questions of considerable biological specificity that she answered with the frank educational approach she brought to all subjects. Mrs. Portillo organized a replacement teacher from a young woman in Las Cruces named Agata, who was competent and kind, and who would hold the school until Ruth was ready to return, which Ruth had no intention of requiring to be longer than necessary. Felix, who was 13 now and whose scholarship to the Santa Fe Academy had been arranged and funded with Roscoe's contribution, and a collection from the town committee, sat in the back of the classroom on Ruth's last day of teaching and looked at her with the expression he usually reserved for philosophical observations about impermanence. "You are coming back," he said, when the other children had left. It was less a question than a statement that required confirmation. "I am absolutely coming back," she said. "Good," he said, in the tone of someone who had been prepared to organize a protest if the answer had been different. "Agata is very nice, but she is not you." Ruth felt a warmth so specific and intense that she had to work not to cry in front of him, because she suspected he would find that embarrassing. "Felix," she said, "you are going to do extraordinary things in this world." He looked both pleased and uncomfortable, the particular expression of a child who has received an adult compliment and does not know the protocol for it. "I know," he said. And then, more quietly, "Thank you, for the scholarship, for everything." She crossed the room and hugged him, which he accepted stiffly, and then, after a moment, returned with the awkward, genuine warmth of a 13-year-old boy who had been managing his own life for long enough to have forgotten how to receive affection, and who was now in the process of remembering. The baby arrived on an April morning in 1885, 2 years almost exactly from the day Ruth had boarded the westbound train in Cincinnati with 2 trunks and a determination to disappear. He arrived in the bedroom of the Double M Ranch house with Mrs. Portillo and the town's physician, a precise and capable man named Dr. Hargreaves in attendance, and he arrived loudly and with a completeness that made his presence in the room immediately undeniable. He was a boy, a substantial, dark-haired, thoroughly healthy boy who opened his eyes and looked at the world with an expression of profound assessment that reminded Ruth instantly and forcibly of his father, Roscoe, who had been stationed in the kitchen for the final 2 hours at the insistence of Mrs. Portillo, and who had spent those 2 hours doing absolutely nothing useful with an intensity that Diego had found extremely moving, was called in when everything was concluded, and the room had been set to rights, and he stood at the side of the bed and looked at his son with an expression that was the same reverence she had seen on his face in the kitchen the previous October, now expanded to fill his entire person. He took the baby when she offered him and held him with a careful sureness that told her he had held babies before at some point and not forgotten the skill, and the baby looked up at him with that assessment expression, and Roscoe looked down with an expression that was, she realized, exactly the same, father and son already engaged in a mutual examination that had the quality of a very long conversation beginning. "He needs a name," she said. "He does." Roscoe looked up from the baby to her. "I thought if you were willing, Henry, for your father." She had told him about her father in one of their October evenings, a man who had been kind and honest and who had died when she was 17, and she had said she missed him with the particular ache you feel for someone whose company would have made your life's harder moments more survivable. She had not expected Roscoe to remember that. She had known, on some level, that he would. "Henry," she said. The name settled into the room like something that had always been there. "Henry Malone," Roscoe said, looking at the baby. "You have a name." Henry Malone appeared to consider this for a moment, and then expressed his opinion in the clear, direct way of new people, and everyone in the room agreed that he was healthy and magnificent and entirely himself. Ruth lay in the bed in the April morning light and listened to the sound of the ranch outside the windows and the sound of her husband talking quietly to their son, and the sound of Mrs. Portillo organizing the kitchen, and the sound of the desert and the mountains, and the deep, permanent, particular silence underneath everything that the territory kept as its own. She was not the woman who had boarded a westbound train in Cincinnati 2 years ago. She was not Ruth Whitmore, who had been poised and composed and graciously subdued, and quietly miserable in ways she had not had the vocabulary to name. She was not even quite the Ruth Thatcher who had walked into the Silver Spur saloon with a desert sunset at her back and found a man with a gun and weathered oak eyes. She was Ruth Thatcher Malone, schoolteacher, wife, mother, resident of Rock, New Mexico Territory, a woman who had come west to forget and had found instead the one thing that made her want to remember everything. The pain and the betrayal and the long roads and the broken wheels and the small storage room behind the schoolhouse and the desert sunsets and the firewood and the dance and the Christmas gift and the ridge above the ranch in the fading light. All of it, every piece of it, because every piece of it had been part of arriving here. She would be back at school by September. She had already been corresponding with Agatha about the curriculum. Felix would come back to visit from the Santa Fe Academy at Christmas, and Roscoe would read to Henry from the shelf of books in the evening, and she would sit in the chair across the fire and watch the two of them and feel the extraordinary, ordinary weight of a life that was exactly what it was supposed to be. Emmett Cruz's saloon thrived after Briggs's departure, and Emmett came to Henry's birth celebration with a bottle of the good whiskey kept behind the bar and a hand-carved wooden horse that he told them he had made himself over the winter, which turned out to be true, and which was the work of considerable skill. Clara Baines brought preserved fruit and a length of fine cotton fabric for baby clothes. Deputy Raines brought a book. Mrs. Portillo brought herself and half the contents of her kitchen, which was perhaps the greatest gift of all. Diego and Thomas and Will came from the bunkhouse with an awkward collective geniality and stood around the cradle with the expressions of men who are deeply uncertain of the protocol for babies but are determined to be present for the occasion. And Diego, who had a child of his own in his hometown in Sonora, and who occasionally sent money south across the border with a care that told you everything you needed to know about what kind of man he was, looked at Henry with a quiet smile and said, in the low voice that he reserved for things that mattered, "He looks like a rancher. He looks like a philosopher," Ruth said. "See that expression." "A philosophical rancher," Roscoe said. "That is probably what this territory needs." They laughed, and Henry, in his cradle, continued his philosophical assessment of the situation with the serene authority of someone who had just arrived and intended to be thorough about it. 2 years later, a girl followed. Ruth and Roscoe named her Clara Margaret. Clara for the woman at the general store who had been one of the first people in Rock to treat Ruth like a person worth knowing, and Margaret for Roscoe's grandmother, a woman he described as the sharpest mind in 3 counties who had wasted it, in his view, on a man who did not deserve it. And he said this with a resolution that told her he had thought about it, and decided that a granddaughter was an appropriate inheritance for a grandmother's sharpness. Clara Margaret arrived with considerably less drama than her brother, and looked at the world with an expression of bright, busy interest that suggested she was already compiling a list of things to investigate. By the time she was 18 months old, she was following Henry around the ranch with a determination that Henry found alternately charming and exasperating. And Henry, who was by this time a 3-year-old of considerable personality, managed his sister with an elder sibling gravity that made Ruth have to leave the room sometimes in order to laugh in private. Felix, at 18, graduated from the Santa Fe Academy with the highest marks in his class and was offered a scholarship to study law in Albuquerque, which he accepted and wrote to tell Ruth about in a letter that was 6 pages long and contained, in the final paragraph, the sentence, "None of this would have been possible without you and Mr. Malone, and I intend to spend the rest of my career being worth the investment, which is the only form of gratitude I know how to give that has any meaning." Ruth read that paragraph to Roscoe at the kitchen table, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "He is going to be formidable," Roscoe said. "He always was," she said. "He just needed someone to open the door." Eleanor came to visit in the summer of 1888, traveling by train to Albuquerque, and then by stage to Rock with the particular combination of excitement and mild hysteria that characterized Alina in new situations. She arrived in a traveling dress that was considerably more fashionable than anything Rock had seen in some time, and immediately began an enthusiastic love affair with the territory's landscape that involved a great deal of standing in doorways and looking at things with her hand pressed to her heart. She took to Roscoe immediately and completely, which Ruth had expected but was still gratified by. She watched Alina ask Roscoe questions about the ranch with the frank inquisitiveness of someone who had been very curious about him for 4 years and had finally been given access, and she watched Roscoe answer with his characteristic patience and directness, and she thought how very different this was from the dinners in Cincinnati, where she had watched Charles perform himself for guests and felt the performance as a kind of chill. On Alina's third day, after Roscoe had taken her and the children on a ride up to the ridge east of the ranch house to see the sunset, and Henry had fallen asleep in front of Roscoe on the horse, and Roscoe had carried him in without waking him, and laid him in his bed with a care that made Alina put her hand over her mouth in the doorway. Alina sat across from Ruth at the kitchen table after the children were in bed and said, "You are the happiest I have ever seen you." "I know," Ruth said. "I mean it as a comparison," Alina said. "I did not realize while you were in Cincinnati how unhappy you were. I think we were all so accustomed to you being composed that we mistook the composure for happiness." Ruth considered this. "I think I made the same mistake," she said. Alina reached across the table and took her hand. "He is a good man," she said. "Roscoe, he is the kind of good that is not about manners or appearances. It is bone deep." "Yes," Ruth said. "That is exactly what it is." Alina left at the end of the week and took with her a basket of preserves from Mrs. Portillo and a hand-carved toy horse that Henry had decided his aunt required, and a letter for their shared acquaintances in Columbus that Ruth had written with a pleasant specificity about her life in the territory, the kind of letter that had the character of someone who had nothing to hide and no interest in pretending otherwise. The years in Rock accumulated with the particular richness that years accumulate when the life they are filling is the right one. Ruth taught until she had shaped 3 different classes of Rock's children and seen them grow into young people who could read and calculate and reason and discuss, and she considered this among the finest work she had ever done. She taught Henry at home when he was old enough and enrolled him in the school when he was old enough for that, and watched him move through his education with the focused appetite that she recognized as both his own and hers. The Double M Ranch grew steadily under Roscoe's careful management, expanding its cattle operation and developing a reputation for producing sound horses that brought buyers from as far as Albuquerque. Diego remained, the most constant and valued of the hands, and Thomas married a young woman named Pillar from a neighboring ranch and built a small house on the eastern edge of the Double M property with Roscoe's blessing and a piece of the land in his name. There was a third child in 1890, another boy named James, who arrived with the same thorough health as his siblings and who had, from his first weeks, the particular quality of a person who is entirely comfortable in his own skin. Henry was James's first and most devoted champion, and Clara Margaret was James's most challenging and most beloved companion, and together the 3 of them populated the Double M with a noise and a life that Roscoe, in his quieter moments, would sometimes stand at the kitchen door and listen to with an expression that Ruth recognized as gratitude so large it had become its own particular form of peace. On an evening in November of 1890, Roscoe and Ruth were sitting on the front step of the ranch house watching the last light go out of the mountains. 7 years since she had come west. 7 years since a wheel had broken 12 miles outside of Rock and the driver had said it was the nearest town with a blacksmith. 7 years since she had pushed open the door of the Silver Spur Saloon and met a gun and a pair of weathered oak eyes and felt something she could not name beginning in her chest. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I am thinking," she said, "about the woman who got on that train in Cincinnati, who she was, What she expected. She expected to disappear, he said. She expected to disappear, Ruth agreed. She expected that the West was large enough to lose herself in. That if she put enough distance between herself and what had happened, it would eventually stop hurting. And did it stop hurting? She turned to look at him. The last light was on his face and in his eyes, those eyes she had been reading for 7 years and was not close to finished reading. Yes, she said, but not because of the distance. It stopped hurting because of this, because of what I found instead of what I was running from. He reached over and took her hand the way he had taken it the first time, across a kitchen table in his ranch house on a January night, with the certainty and the gentleness of someone who had made a choice and was at peace with it. I have spent 8 years on this land, he said, putting myself into it, trying to make it mine, and the truth is it never felt entirely mine until you were in it. She leaned her head against his shoulder. The desert settled into its profound evening silence around them, and the stars were beginning to appear above the mountains, the extraordinary western stars that she had fallen in love with early in her first Red Rock autumn, and that still, every clear night, made her feel the smallness and the wonder of being alive in the middle of all that space. Inside the house, James was asleep, and Henry and Clara Margaret were being put to bed by the particular negotiation process that Clara Margaret required each evening before consenting to the concept of sleep. The ranch was quiet beyond the house, the cattle settled and the horses in the paddock, and the light in Diego's window warm and constant. Ruth Thatcher Malone sat on the step of the Double M Ranch house with her husband's hand in hers, and looked at the mountains and the stars, and felt the full, completed shape of the story she was living. She had come west to forget. She had found the one man who made her want to remember. She had found a town that had needed what she had to give and had given back in equal measure. She had found students who would carry her forward into lives she would never see in full. She had found a self that was larger and more honest and more durable than the one she had arrived with. She had found in the most unexpected place, by the most accidental route, on the back of a broken wheel and a darkening sky, and a door pushed open in a moment of need, the truest and most permanent version of the life she had been capable of living all along. She would not have traded any of it, not the pain of what had been, not the fear of those first months, not even the particular Tuesday morning in Cincinnati that had broken what needed to break so that something real could grow in its place. She held Roscoe's hand in the November dark and was grateful for all of it, the whole improbable, beautiful road that had led her here, to this step, to this man, to this extraordinary, ordinary life that was entirely, irrevocably, and perfectly hers. The stars burned on above Red Rock, above the Double M, above the mountains and the desert floor and the small adobe schoolhouse with its clean-swept steps, and the West did what it had always done, indifferent to human drama and human joy in equal measure, vast and patient and magnificently unconcerned. And in the middle of all that vastness, 2 people sat together in the warm dark and were, completely and without reservation, home.